Welcome to Mental Healthy, the podcast where we share stories of the professionals and experts worldwide working in the mental health field. Here's your host, Dr. Kenyon Knapp.
Well, welcome everyone to the podcast today. I'm glad to have you here with us. I've got a great guest with me here today, Jessica Behne, and she, along with two other authors, just wrote a really, really good book. I've been reading it. It's Unseen Warrior. I'll hold it up close. And so welcome to the podcast today, Jessica.
Thank you for having me. I love Liberty University, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm grateful you're on the podcast as well. I know this book just came out. It's really, really good. I've been so impressed with it as I've been reading it. It's very readable and really well done. But before we get to the book, though, tell us a little bit about yourself, because my listeners are mental health professionals and graduate students all over the country, and they'd love to know more about you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I guess I had to tell a little bit of my background in order for me to explain why we even wrote the book. So I'm a Marine. My husband's active duty. I just got out of the reserves after 13 years of active duty and reserve time. There was a point when I got off of active duty in 2016. I just felt this void, this loss, this despair in that moment. And it kind of started me on this entire journey of, but why? And so I started my master's program, got licensed as a marriage and family therapist. And ever since then, I've been researching, studying the population of military and veterans and just trying to understand, I guess, research is research. So trying to understand myself, and kind of this led to writing the book eventually. So I'm now in my PhD program at Regent University, third year. So one more year, I'm about to graduate, very excited. And I had the opportunity to write this book, and it's been an amazing journey, and I loved every moment of it, even the blood, sweat, and tears.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations on being near the end of your doc program. That's exciting. And I noticed too in the book that the subtitle of the book, Unseen Warrior, the subtitle is A Military Cultural Guide for Mental Health Professionals. Let's begin there. Why don't you describe for us a little bit about, like, how do you build rapport with military, people, service people, and what's the culture in the military as far as you building that rapport? I said to you earlier when we were chatting that I have some family members who are in the service, but I can tell when I talk to them, there's like this whole culture that I only halfway get it. So tell me about that culture, and how can therapists relate to that better?
Oh my goodness. So we're our own culture. We have our own values, our norms. What's interesting is the APA only came out with a definition of military culture in 2021. So extremely, very recently. And then there are some few articles by Cameron in 2022 and 2023 kind of expounding upon what military culture is. And so the book title, Unseen Warrior, is really based off of that service member or that veteran coming into a mental health professional's office and being seen as a civilian. We're not a civilian. Our brain doesn't work as it once did before we joined the military. There's a whole transformational process that happens from the time that you start boot camp up through that integration through the military and assimilation into that culture. And then eventually that transitional period. There's some, in my opinion, some neurological and cognitive changes that happen for us to be able to adapt to chaos, in the midst of chaos, to respond immediate obedience to orders. And so I kind of give the analogy of, if you're in boot camp and starting with that foundational training or any supplemental training afterwards, your fight, flight, and freeze cannot be activated. You must listen while things are going chaotically around you, and then bunks are being thrown and racks are being tossed, and you must just listen and respond. Well, what happens to that brain under that stress inoculation? That's kind of the $1 million question. And I think that would kind of lead into, how does that then affect us clinically when we're sitting in a mental health professional's office, and the way we respond to emotions and stress and tragedy is all very different. And I think that hasn't been taken into perspective, with much of the research being once the service member deployed, or military sexual assault, or even the transition out of the military. without taking into account that there's this whole under layer of transformational journey that we go through prior to any of those secondary effects. So it's really fascinating. I think that there's much to be studied, even though we just came out of a 20-year war, there's still so much unknown. And at the end of the day, our dropout rates are much higher than our civilian counterparts. We don't respond the same efficacies to modalities or even medications. So I'm kind of asking the question why, and that's kind of where this book starts to fill in some of those theoretical approaches of what could be going on to then transform us when we're sitting in front of that mental health professional.
That makes a lot of sense. And I could tell as I was reading the introduction that the authors are all people who've served in the military, aren't they?
Yes, this is one of the unique factors. I won't say this is the only book out there, but this is the only book that I've found that has all three of us served in the military, and all three of us are mental health professionals. And we serve from different lenses as well. So, like I said, I'm a marriage and family therapist. Sam is going to be a psychologist. He served in the Marine Corps, like myself. And then Dr. Hogue is a psychiatrist who served 20 years in the Army, and now he works on the outside, working with the same population. Together, collectively, we have about 50 years of military experience and 30 years of mental health experience. So we lived the journey at which we are studying and have devoted our entire careers to, which is an amazing compilation of wealth of knowledge from the perspective of the client and the mental health professional.
That's great. I know also for people who are in the service too, reading the book from people who are service members too you got street cred. I guess is the way I would say it. Because I've worked with people in my private practice. I've been in LPC for 30 years now myself, and I know with me not having served in the service, people are people, but at the same time, there is a difference between those who've served and those who haven't. For me, and I guess part of your book is that there's a goal for the therapist to establish trust and rapport and to be able to relate well to the service member, the client who's a service member. So could you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, what are some of the things you found in the book about how therapists can relate better to military service members who are clients?
Absolutely. So I first say the first thing we start off with the book is try to immerse yourself into the culture, whatever that looks like. Whether it's a History Channel, reading the Commandant's reading list is a great way to start actually getting to the military literature. And I say all this because, again, the way that we deal with trauma is oftentimes dark humor, or avoidance. We typically have numbed down emotions where we only feel anger or nothing. We have a hard time really tapping into those core emotional responses and need help kind of getting to that place where we can actually feel safe processing those emotions. Emotions will get you killed. So they were very unsafe in other conditions. And here we are sitting in front of someone who wants to talk about feelings. And that's very scary. Now, there's two different ways we could talk about this. The active duty service member, they're still in that stress inoculated chronic stress condition response. And so oftentimes they can't really do a deep dive into their childhood trauma and how that is affecting them today, or how I've had service members who had combat exposure and had some residual issues from that combat exposure, but in combat, they had a trigger response from their childhood trauma, which blew my mind, is that the things that happened in their childhood was activated in a war zone, and they were triggered in the war zone from the original trauma, which makes it complicated when that person's sitting in front of you and treating that person, kind of figuring out where do we start. So if you're talking about a veteran who's sitting in front of you, they have been dispelled from their culture, their coping skills, their structure, their friends, their job. And now they are lost in the world trying to get their feet underneath them and figure out how to live in this chaotic civilian life. They come to your office, and I can say from personal experience, you want to feel normalized at the last line of resort. I'm going to a therapist. I want to feel normal. I just got out of the military. And the therapist treats you as if you're this foreign entity. They don't understand your language. They are concerned about how your dark humor is. They don't understand your jargon, your acronyms. They don't even understand your branch of service. And not only did you feel completely isolated coming into that therapist's office, someplace that was supposed to be safe is now they don't even understand me. They don't even understand who I am. So I must be broken. I must be damaged. And that's kind of what service members take away from bad therapeutic experiences. So how do we change that? It's just a sense of curiosity. We love when a therapist is curious and eager to learn about us. But if we tell them something once, we want them to remember it. We don't want to have to keep repeating ourselves over and over again about the job we did or the MOS. Well, what is an MOS? Well, that's what we call a job. Simple terms like that. And the book kind of has an entire appendix in the back that kind of goes through military jargon, acronyms, rank structure, because that's all going to matter about if I am a NCO versus am I a staff officer. Those are very different positions in the military. And to try to explain it becomes very frustrating for us because we spend more time explaining our culture to the mental health professional than actually receiving the treatment at times. And so I think kind of doing the front end work, if you're going to work with this population, to really understand and assimilate as best you can into the culture versus projecting yourself onto us. And I guess that's the final note is therapists often project themselves and how they see the world onto us and expect us to assimilate to them, to the civilian. And that really ruptures your core too. So we say you're always an outsider until you're not. And when you're not, we'll adopt you into our culture. But until then, you're always an outsider. And so just kind of know that that rapport is very temperamental, especially in the beginning, as they want to get to know that they can trust you, that you have their back, that you can watch their six. I think that that's kind of the point that we make often, at least very early on in the book and throughout the book, is try to understand that we're not civilian and the way we perceive the world is not civilians, and be curious about that aspect of us.
That makes a lot of sense. But then I'm thinking too of the therapy process, like, and you write about it in the book, which is great. But in a typical therapy session, you have like an intake and you do this big comprehensive history and they tell you about themselves. But obviously, I mean, just like civilians or military, if they don't trust you, they're not going to reveal everything.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of those dynamics with a military service member when you're trying to do a good job and take a really comprehensive history and look at all the stuff in their background, but they don't know if they can trust you or not? Like, what are some of those dynamics with the service member?
You have to be very clear on your role. If I worked at a military base and installation, and that role, not only was there limits to my confidentiality, there was also a role that I played as an advocate for the military and for the service member. In the civilian world, I own my own business, my role is different. And so service members immediately are going to say, are you going to diagnose me? There are diagnoses, that you can't serve in the military if you have. Now, I don't want to say this is an all-encompassing list, but anything outside of anxiety, depression, maybe mild PTSD, oftentimes, again, not an all-encompassing list, you can get kicked out for. You can't serve in the military if you have a diagnosis that requires psychotropic drugs or medication that can alter your brain chemistry. You can imagine we do a lot of life-threatening and life-risking activities in the military context, whether it's training or deployment. And so those diagnoses are just not able to thrive. You can't have that in the military, if that makes sense. And so the service member is going to ask very bluntly, oftentimes, that's their fear. If you diagnose me with this thing, I can get kicked out. Who's going to find this out? Who's going to know about this? Is my command going to know about this? Is my career going to be ripped out from underneath me because of these things? And so that's really kind of teetering the line in that gray area of diagnosing someone appropriately, making sure you get them the clinical help they need, working with their doctors, or on the outside, if you're working with a veteran. I have veterans who aren't able to take SSRIs because they work within a certain industry in the civilian world, where they feel like that would hinder their job and they would not be able to do that job anymore if they were diagnosed or on medication. So this is all very complex. If you think about, it's not as simple as that DSM code it also is what effects will that have on that person's career? And perhaps it should have an effect on them. Maybe this isn't the right lifestyle for them. And that could be very true too. And so there's a lot of power differential in what you hold versus that person who's coming to you trying to get to the acceptance of being vulnerable with you. And so just kind of understanding that it's not as simple as, well, just take time off from the military, or let me just diagnose this person with this particular code. So yes, I think that there's a lot of power that's held between this relationship, and that service members coming in not knowing when their power is going to be taken from them, which is extremely scary for us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You remind me, I mentioned to you earlier before we started the podcast, my older brother was in the Air Force. He was a pilot. And I remember about, 15 years ago, he was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. And he got an opportunity to fly a presidential detail on some big international trip somewhere. And when he was selected for that role, he had to receive a full psychological and, a much more intense security background check. And I recall him telling me that diagnoses, like you're saying, can affect their security clearance. And
yes, absolutely.
And it's supposedly a little bit better today, a little more lenient today than it was 15 years ago, but it still can affect opportunities and things like that. So I remember he told me, he said, "Hey, Kenny, they're going to give me this." That's what my family calls me. They call me Kenny. He said, "Hey, Kenny, they're going to give me the MMPI-2 and all this other stuff. And, how do I pass it and all that?" And I just said, "Alan, I'm sorry, Alan, but you're screwed." So but amazingly, he passed it somehow, and he flew the president's Secret Service guys around somewhere in Europe or something like that. But anyway, all that story aside, you raised a great point, though. When they come to us, that fear of it affecting security clearance or opportunities or whatever, how do you balance that? Like, because we have some degree of confidentiality that we get to have, but then you have to document things as well. So how do you balance that so that you can build trust and confidence with the service member?
Yeah, this is one of those very tricky lines that you walk, and to know that your words mean something. So if you are accepting TRICARE or work for the DoD, your words are very powerful. So mean what you say and say what you mean. If your intentionality is this person is not adjusting well to this lifestyle, of course, there will be further on evaluations within the military construct, but that has an impact, and maybe it should have an impact. I had a service member who wasn't adjusting well and was continuing to deteriorate within the stress of the military itself, and it wasn't getting any better, just a lifestyle. And so I had to send that person up for further evaluation to potentially get out of the military. It just wasn't a good fit for their mental health. On the flip side, remember, if you're a prescriber of medication, what are those side effects? Because weight gain is also a reason that service members have to get kicked out of the military or have to leave the military. Side effects, weight gain, is this going to affect their military performance? On the veteran side of the house, and I could say the active duty too, if we really want to take that history of what medication they are consuming, over-the-counter medication, and also what they're being prescribed, especially if they're kind of getting treated in the mental health sphere, I say because there's oftentimes a delay, sometimes, I can't say often, but sometimes there's a delay in receiving those medications and getting into their prescriber and getting it refilled. And so I had my best friend served in 03, 04, and 05. He saw a lot of combat in the height of the war. He's on an SSRI. And in order to get a VA appointment to get reevaluated to maintain that SSRI was like a 6-month waiting list. And so he ran out 3 months into it and had to go cold turkey off of that medication. And there was no gap filler. And so here he is, cold turkey, after taking a very high dose of a certain medication. And that was just it. Survive for 3 months until we can get you in to get you back on the particular dose. So there's a lot of nuances even in the subcultures of which we're talking about within the military, and how not only your role in the diagnosing, but also being that advocate and managing that person and being able to reach out to those providers and saying, hey, this person needs to maintain this medication. They can't go off of it cold turkey. So I think that's important too. It's just understanding you're also that advocate for that person and also that person that holds a lot of power.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, listeners, I'd encourage you to check this book out and get a copy. It's brand new. Once again, Unseen Warrior, a military cultural guide for mental health professionals. Check it out. It's available right now on Amazon and also at KendallHuntPublishers.com. So you mentioned in the book, too, that people's experiences with deployments and all is part of the military identity. And in the book, you talk about how you served in the Philippines, and your husband, who's a contributor, he served in Australia and Afghanistan and things like that. Talk to us about that. How do you delve into that whole topic of deployments and asking about that? Because it's apparently a sensitive topic.
Yes. So if you lived in our world, you're like, deployments don't always mean going to the Middle East, right? Especially now, since we are technically pulled out of the Middle East, technically. Deployments can be anything. And I say that with a laughter because it's based on the amount of time that we are out of the country oftentimes, but it's also the community, right? So to simplify it, a Navy SEAL might go deploy for 2 weeks in a place that's very austere and then come back. Where a Navy sailor might go on a MEU for 6 months, a Marine might go to Australia or Okinawa or to an operationally combat zone or humanitarian mission. With all that said, asking those questions, not just did you deploy, but how long were you deployed? How many deployments? Where did you go? And we're not trying to be nosy and ask some of the horrible questions like, what is the worst thing you've ever done there? That would be a terrible question. I would stick to just understanding the effects that deployment had on that individual. I had a special operator who deployed hundreds of times over the course of his career. And it was literally hundreds because he'd be out the door for 2 weeks, back for a week, out the door for 2 weeks, back for a week. And he would be going to places that were active zones of conflict, but only a few of those core memories were really affecting him. And that's what we were discussing in counseling. Not everything, just a few cores. I've had individuals who never deployed, but had this sense of, I didn't do the job I was trained for. And that sense of I was left behind, or I didn't actually accomplish the mission. Or I have a service member who deployed in Beirut, and he also deployed in Desert Storm, saw and did a lot of things. And now that war is kind of forgotten. And so we started talking about, and my husband and I were conversing, and this is also in the book too. And fun fact, there's QR codes in the front of each chapter that you can scan, and it will show a video of the author who wrote that chapter, or a compilation of all of us talking about that chapter itself.
There it is, right there, folks.
My husband and I I'm so excited. It's so, you'll see our dogs in the picture as well. But my husband and I talk about how it is to be dual military, how it is to be me coming off and being a veteran and still married to a service member, and then how it is to just be a spouse to an active duty service member. And that sense of like, I lost that identity with him and that relationship changed, or the sense of we're both out the door. In our first 2 years of marriage, we were only together for about 3.5 months over a course of 2 years within the first 2 years of marriage. So there's lots of systems effects that you can look at within the marriage and family therapy, or there's lots of effects onto the family and children. And that we have a whole chapter, we have a contributing author to Holly Barron and Mary Tatum. Both are married to service members, and they contributed as well. And Holly wrote about how it is to have a family and move across country and have your husband in and out for deployments. So I say, yes, as a mental health professional, know that this is multi-layered within one system, and it affects everyone within that system in very different ways each time. And so I guess the last note is, and this is probably a personal note, I found it easier, and this is, I can say for myself, when I was downrange, I was in the mission, I was in the fight, I knew my family was being taken care of. It was way more difficult for me to be back in garrison, back home when my husband was deployed. I felt absolutely helpless while he was gone downrange. I was taking care of the day to day, and of course, everything always breaks. The moment he leaves the door, everything breaks.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I become from a 2-person household to a 1-person household, having to manage life on my own for 8 months or more. Deployments have different lengths of time. And that is also a whole different challenge, but there's a resiliency to it too. And the culture has resiliency in how the units try to take care of the families, and how there's on base, there's just a different culture, even when you live on base. And how when people deploy, neighbors just come out, what do you need? How can I help you? And so there tends to be positives and negatives. And again, just exploring that with your service member and how those events affected them or maybe didn't affect them. And that's not what they're here to process.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, let me ask you this too. I know in the book you talk about treatment efficacy and trying to help your clients stay with you, but there's a dropout rate with everyone. How do you try to prevent dropout by addressing barriers with the service members?
I think that kind of comes back down to making a clear understanding of what your role is, what their role is, how you're here to advocate for them, trying to lower that power differential when you're sitting in that office with them. I think at the end of the day, they need to know that they can trust you, but to what extent? Like where is that confidentiality limit, and within the state that you live in too, and then how you are there to support them and invest into their growth. I think that's where it really is. Most of the most powerful conversations I had was sitting in the field with other Marines and just talking. And so when we talk about efficacy for modalities, my personal opinion is we want that human connection with that mental health professional. I say that's through a narrative type approach. A lot of approaches have narrative type aspects when you're building that report. Some are more structured. It seems that the more structured approaches have higher dropout rates. That's my opinion, based on some of the research that's out there. And I think that that's because that rapport building, that time to really invest into understanding that human being sitting in front of you is not there. And so whatever modality you choose, whatever your flavor of the month is, I would say getting to know that human being sitting in front of you through that narrative type initial approach will allow them to trust that rapport. They get to know you a little bit, but you get to know them extensively and what they want to share. Because once they trust you, it's like a word vomit salad. They just want to talk and tell you about their career and what they did, and joke with you. And maybe there's a little deflection, but they'll come back and they'll tell you what they don't want you to hear as long as you're willing to listen. And I always say it's that listening ear and that active listening and being receptive to that culture that makes us feel welcomed. And it's okay to share a little bit about yourself too. And like you did with me earlier about your family, and you didn't personally serve. And that builds that rapport as well. I'm very much an advocate of clinical sharing as long as it builds rapport. It is very much appropriate because it makes you less sterile when I come into the office.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You talk a lot in the book about creating a safe environment with the client. And what are some of the, I mean, people who are listening to this are a lot of graduate students and mental health professionals around the country, some of whom are military people like you and some are not. What advice would you give them about creating that safe environment? Maybe in a way that's a little idiosyncratic for a military person as compared to a civilian.
Yeah, I think that, remember, again, this is a blanketed statement. There's always going to be a service member that's like, I'm not like that. We're oftentimes like the kid with the sand table. I have a fidget tools right here on my desk right now. I want to be able to touch things. Sometimes I want to deflect and not be as serious if a topic hits too close to home, and then bring me back to that topic. But I think also thinking about the space and the layout and where's your office positioned. Oftentimes you'll see service members want to not have their back to the door, or they get overwhelmed by crowded spaces. They want that privacy. They want to be able to sit and have a conversation with you. But just doing that alone and talking about feelings is, like I reiterated, it's extremely nerve-wracking. So I would have stress balls throughout my office in the shape of grenades. Just because they got a kick out of it, or the textile balls where they could squeeze and touch, and you would just see them, especially when stressful topics, they would just be ripping this ball apart as they're trying to stay grounded and they're trying to stay focused, and they trust
Mhm.
that you got their back. And I see that's really important, to make the environment comfortable. Don't be sitting at the desk and looking at your computer, because again, that eye contact, that sense of respect, that sense of I'm here with you and I'm holding the space with you. We're observing everything that you do, body language, your words that you say. If we feel like you're not attentive, it's like, well, you don't really care about us. You're not really invested. And for me to share something so vulnerable, you're
Mhm.
not invested. Think of this more as a relationship with your partner. You want that one-on-one full contact, and understanding that I'm safe with you. And that can be taken away. And I've seen that personally with individuals who are taking intakes and they're typing on the computer as the intake is happening, or they're yawning, or there's things within between you and I, like a document that they're taking. It just really makes those barriers of, this is clinical and clinical isn't safe, so let me run away, versus, okay, we're sitting
Yeah.
in the field and we're just talking. And now I can kind of share with you some intimate parts of my life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I tell you what, I want to respect your time, and we're getting near the end here to wrap things up. But what I always do with all the folks I interview is I ask sort of an end catch-all question of, what else would you like the listeners to hear today that I haven't asked you about yet, or what did I leave out in the questioning? So you can think about that. But once again, listeners, the book Unseen Warrior, a military cultural guide for mental health professionals. Please check it out today and get a copy. I'm sure it'll really help you with the clientele you work with. But Jessica, let me just ask you that final question. What else have we not touched on today that you'd like to leave with the listeners?
Oh, that's such a great question. I feel like I've talked a lot, but I think if were just to say one more shout out for the book, the way I really envisioned this book and it came to life was, the first chapter is really going to talk about that transitional phase from civilian to military. We're going to talk about boot camp. We're going to talk about the different branches, kind of go into detail about what makes each branch unique, that stress inoculation. And then the chapters that follow are amazing. They go through developmental stagnation, they go through military sexual assault, deployment, military families, psychopharmacology chapter in there that talks about what medications are more beneficial for service members versus others. And then at the end, we have a whole entire clinical guide on, okay, so all of this information, what do you do with it? And it's a clinical mental health guide on, like, step 1 to step 7, how do you work with a military client, and what modalities or techniques really have been seen to have strong efficacy within the population. And so I think that this is a holistic compilation of just information that kind of crawl, walk, runs into this population. So you can take it with you and just really kind of understand everything from start to finish. And that's really what I love about this book. All the photos in it are actual military photos from public affairs. So everything you see is genuine photos from public affairs. We have salient quotes from service members that I worked with. I have, in the deployment chapter, one of my best friends I was speaking about earlier has an entire section where he talks about his deployment experience from start to finish, and the death and the loss of individuals and how that affected him. As I said, this is a holistic guide. It is, in my opinion, it allows the reader to go from the novice to more experienced. And no matter what clinical lens you look through, I feel like you can extrapolate at least something from the way it's written and pull from this information. I'm so thankful to my authors that helped put this together, and Kendall Hunt, and the contributing authors. They really just brought this entire project to life. So I'm very blessed.
Absolutely. And listeners, I'll tell you what, it's really well referenced. I mean, it's really very academic, but at the same time, sometimes academic stuff can be really dry and boring, and I'll just say it's very well written. I mean, I really have to compliment you, Jessica. It's really readable. It's I don't want to say conversational, but because it's very informational,
Mhm.
but it wasn't dry reading at all. It's not like reading a dry journal article. It's it's just so practical the way it's all written. So thank you for doing it. I know it was a real labor of love for you to put all this time and effort into the book. Thank you for joining us today on the podcast. We really appreciate it. And once again, listeners, Unseen Warrior, get a copy. I'm sure you'll love it. It's going to be great. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you again.
Appreciate it. And thank you, listeners, for joining us as well. We look forward to having you join us next time here on the Mental Healthy Podcast. Have a good day.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mental Healthy. If you want to hear more episodes, please hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts and head to linktree.com/mentalhealthypodcast for all of our social media platforms with the latest mental healthy content. If you have a story to share that relates to what we discussed in this episode or any other episode, please contact us at mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. That's mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. Thank you, and God bless.